Okay, good morning, everybody. So why don't we get started? What we were discussing yesterday in this Biurim, we know that there's an Isser of Lifnei Iver, Lo Sitein Michshol. Do not place a stumbling block before a blind person, which means do not incite or cause another person, watch your step, to commit an Avera. Okay, so this has to do with lending money without a contract or without witnesses. You could potentially be causing someone to sin by not being able to collect on the loan and causing a person to deny a loan that they owe. And this got into the question in the Biurim as to what really is the halacha regarding what if your whole objective is testing someone. You don't intend to get them to sin. You just want to see if they will, if they are a person of integrity. So the story that we saw in the Gemara yesterday was the story of Ravina and Rav Ashi, that they told Rav Ashi that Ravina was a person who had a high regard for all of the rabbinic practices. And so Rav Ashi basically came to him like Erev Shabbos and said, I need to borrow some money. Can you lend me 100 dinar or 10 dinars to buy a piece of property? And it was Erev Shabbos that we couldn't find a scribe. And Ravina said, yeah, but we need to write this down. And so that was the test. And it seems like it was really a test. And you want to argue. So there, it might seem that you see from there that it's okay to test someone to see if they observe the halacha. But on the other hand, Rav Stern argued that may over there, it was only a rabbinic law, and so it's not so pashut. I'm going to skip a few lines. Just see, I'm skipping too much. Achar ze ra'isi b'chazonish shvia simin yud beis otztes shekosav li'inyano v'shayich gam hacha v'zelushano. The nira dahade hekilu chachamim b'safek. He says the chachamim were lenient when it comes to certain issues of safek. Afal gab de safek michshol, so that there's a safek whether you're going to be causing a person to sin or not. Vadai aser litain lifnei iver. Well, you're not allowed to place a stumbling block before a blind person. So if so, you should say to yourself, even if there's a suffix that I'm causing him to sin, it should be usher for me to do that. Mishum de'im banu lahachmir b'sveikos nami na'asem michshol shenimna chesed v'darchei chayim v'sholom me'atzmeinu u'mehen. He says, I guess, I'm not sure exactly in that situation, he says, if we're going to be machmir in sveikos, we could also make a michshol, we could also make a stumbling block, because we would prevent a person the opportunity to do chesed. The hein rak, I'm not sure what the ayin hey stands for. V'chayavin anachnu lahachiosum laheitiv imohim. Kol shekain shelo laharbos sina v'tachrus beinenu v'neihem va'ovrim al lo sisna v'od kama lavin she'eni surin kal me'isr zeh shanu boim lahatzilos osam mimenu v'hilkach shaklu chazal b'feles ad kama sheyesh liznahig lakom sam v'limshoch yadeinu mehem v'shelo ligrom michsholim yoser gedolim lanu lahem v'lanu v'chul leser l'machram bizman shuhu vadai la'avera v'lahatir b'safik v'zu derech ha'memutzas v'ha'yeshara ad kam l'shana. So the whole discussion over there is misha chashud al hashvias, that if a person is suspect of not being careful with the laws of Shemitah, You're still allowed to sell them something that they could potentially use in a permissible way during Shemitah and could potentially use in a prohibited way. Because we know that there are certain types of produce that you're not allowed to hold on to them for a longer period of time than when they're available out in the field. That's one of the laws of Shemitah. So can I sell someone a Shemitah product that I'm not sure if they're careful with the laws of Shemitah or not? So the answer is you are allowed to. And it sounds like over there that if it's only a suffix whether they'll do the Avera or not, and perhaps they won't do the Avera, perhaps they will, then I'm still permitted to help them or abet them in doing the Avera if it's only a suffix. So therefore, since it's not for sure that he's going to succumb to an Avera, so then you're allowed to sell to him and to lend to him. And therefore, if that's the case, we have to understand why is it that in previous cases there was a concern that even if a person will potentially do an Avera, then there's a prohibition still of lifnei iver. So the first answer that Reb Stern gives is v'yesh lomer de bashvius ein daito klal al ma'isa avera, that maybe you're not, because by Shemitah your intent is not to cause him to sin. And so maybe if you're lending him, let's say you're lending him a tool that he can use out in the field, and you're concerned that he's going to use that tool to improperly cultivate Shemitah produce or harvest Shemitah produce, okay? But it's also possible that he won't. And so therefore, it's not something that you mamish intend to do. He says, whereas in a situation where you are specifically doing an act that will test if a person will do an Avera or not, so that might actually be worse. So he says, but it could be that when your whole objective in doing this experiment, leaving the $10 bill or $20 bill out from Matilda, or just to see if someone's going to do an Avera, so then it could be that's usher. That's what he wants to suggest. And then he quotes this Chasam Sofer that we just read. And the Chasam Sofer says that im banu lahachmir b'sfeikos, when it comes to lifnei iver, if I am going to desist from helping another Jew because I'm worried that he may do an Avera in the course of my helping him, then it's a question of weighing what is the greatest good and what is the greatest evil. So he says, Ve'hin rak am ha'aretz v'chayavan anachnu lahachyosim la'itiv imayim. Just because a person may not be meticulous in the law, because they're an am ha'aretz, but we still have a mitzvah to help them whenever we can. And certainly not to withdraw from them out of a fear that they're going to do an Avera. Like, can I lend a person a car knowing that he's going to drive with it on Shabbos? Can I give a person my, a bowl of sugar knowing that he may make something that's treif? He says, that's not lifnei iver, says the Chazon Ish. Just because he may not be meticulous in halacha, I still have a mitzvah to have kinship and fellowship with him. So I may end up doing more harm by refraining from helping them out of a fear they're going to do an Avera, because I'll generate a bigger Avera, which is to create enmity between Jews. And so the Chazon Ish was very insightful in this area. If I do something out of a concern, well, maybe they're not going to, trying to think of a good example, but I've had situations like this in many instances where can I invite a Jew over knowing that maybe they'll drive to my house on Shabbos and things like that, right? Well, maybe they won't. And which is the greater good, to make sure that they feel a sense of kinship to their Orthodox Jewish friend, or to make sure that they don't, that maybe they will, maybe they won't violate Shabbos. It was on this basis that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said that as long as they have the ability to walk to your house on Shabbos, you can invite them, even if you know that in all likelihood they're going to drive. He says, "V'hilkach shaklu chazal befeles ad kama sheyesh liznahig lekonsam v'limshoch yadeinu mehem." And therefore, our sages weighed carefully to what degree do we have to refrain from interacting with people who are going to do averas, and not to cause even greater enmity or blockages and sin between ourselves and them. And therefore they said, if you know for sure that they're going to do an avera with the object, so then it's lifnei iver. But if it's only a possibility that they'll violate the laws of Shemitah, and you don't know for sure whether they will or whether they won't, so then it's not a problem. And he continues. He says, and so that may or may not be proof that you're allowed to leave the $20 bill out for Matilda, because there with Matilda, your whole objective is to test her. And we said before that it may also not be proof from the story of Ravina and Ravashi, because in that situation, it may have only been a rabbinic law. And this is you're setting someone up to commit a biblical violation of whatchamacallit, of stealing, right? So he says, but bottom line is that, but it's only a suffix when you're trying to test someone, right? He says, there's a Gemara that says that there's a nisser of lifnei iver when you strike, physically hit your adult child. Because even though corporal punishment is sanctioned in halacha, but when you strike an adult child, you're provoking the child to hit you back. And if a child hits a parent, they're violating a biblical prohibition. So you're not allowed to strike an adult child. That the story that is brought by the Gemara is that the housekeeper of Rebbe once saw a man striking his adult son. And she said that person should be placed under a ban, meaning he should be put into cherem, because he was in violation of lifnei iver. Okay? The kasha. Now the question is, this man wasn't intending. His objective was not to provoke his son to hit him back. And it's not, you're not for sure causing your son to sin by striking him. When you don't know for a fact that the son is going to rebel against the father, so why is there lifnei iver over there? You're not testing him. You're not, right? You don't know for sure that he's going to strike back. And the answer is that even though it's not for sure, but you're doing something that is quite a common thing to occur. The Ritva explains that Niran Hadvarim Delo Gadol Gadol Mamish, he says it doesn't literally mean an adult child. It could mean a child who's a teenager. a child, who is approaching adulthood and is not fully mature. And it all depends on the age of the child. That if you determine that the child is excitable and will rebel against the parent by being struck, so then what you're doing is being over on lifnei iver. He says, "V'hinei lichora benidon didan hu eitza shiafkiris ma'osav shesham osam lenasosa." He says, so getting back to our question about leaving the 20 for Matilda, he says, it would seem to me that if you're going to do this, and it's something that could quite likely happen that she's going to take the 20, and there's an issur of lifnei iver, potentially deoraisa, the best thing to do is to declare your $20 bill hefker before you leave it on the dresser. And the reason for that is that in that case, she will not be guilty of theft. Oh, sheyakna osamlo, or to tell your wife, here, I'm giving you this $20 bill, you acquire it on behalf of Matilda. That way, even if the housekeeper ends up stealing the 20, you will not be over on lifnei iver because you made it hefker. She's taking what belongs to her. So therefore, do you have a right? Here, I say to my wife, take this 20, acquire it on behalf of Matilda. So it now belongs to Matilda. Then you take the 20, you put it down on the dresser. So if Matilda ends up pocketing it, it's hers. Okay.
She doesn't know it's hers.
Right. You just see that she doesn't have morals. Yeah, that's right. What? Sure, it's grounds for dismissal.
She doesn't know.
When you know an employee steals from you, that's certainly grounds for dismissal. She doesn't know that she's not stealing. She's demonstrated that she's immoral, that she's prepared to steal. So
it's not so simple. I went through this whole process so many.
Did you really?
Yes. You have to have more proof than to say it was there.
Well, when you have an employee contract, I understand in a business, when someone's a housekeeper in your house, then it's a little bit easier to dismiss them, But then he says, but he says, but it's still not so simple. He says, the hatos sham kiddush lamed beis amud aleph, kasba de tzarich lomer shahodio kodem lachein shelo yehi kamo niskaben lechol basar chazir va'ala biyado basar tleh shetzarich mechila v'kapara ad kan l'shana. He says that if you put out kosher food, but represented as non-kosher, and you put it out for a person to see if they're going to eat it or not, right? So even though if they eat it, they're eating kosher food, but if they think it's non-kosher, Tosfos says they still need mechila v'kapara. They still need forgiveness. They need to do tshuva because in their mind they thought that they were eating treif. Yeah. So alma da'af hecha de'ena over al isser mamish, and also the person who left it out for them to entrap them also needs forgiveness. Mikol makom hol v'kavanasu li'isser shuv asur l'nasosu mishum lifnei iver. So if you're causing them to do an aveira, because a person who thinks it's treif, even if it's kosher, and eats it, needs forgiveness, it means that they actually have done a sin. So if Matilda takes the 20, thinking that she's stealing, even when she's not, she's done an aveira, and she has to get forgiveness from God. She'll have to go to church and confess to the priest. She'll feel terrible, and so I leaving it out for her have been over on lifnei iver. Omnam yesh lahayer midivrei hamagin Avram shehevi b'shem habach, and it's talking about over there that you're not allowed to give food to someone who has not done netilas yadayim because of lifnei iver. That's what the context of the halacha over there is. Zelashano dafka benetilas yadayim aser takef b'shashanosin liyadu k'dei lechol over mishum lifnei iver. He says the only time that it's aser to give food to someone when they haven't washed their hands is when they haven't washed their hands, because as soon as you give it to them and they take it from you, the avera is instantaneous. In other words, there is such a halacha that you're not allowed to feed someone who's not going to do netilas yadayim. But there are heterim for it. And so we're not as careful about this halacha as you would think. But this halacha is codified in Shulchan Aruch. And why is it? You're over on lifnei iver, because you're causing them to eat bread without doing netilas yadayim. And the Bach writes over there, the Magen Avram writes over there, that that's only if you know they're not going to wash. But aval bibracha b'shashanosno eno over. But if you know they're not going to make a bracha, that's not lifnei iver. Oh, so the issue is, how instantaneous is it? In other words, when I put a piece of a roll, let's say I put it in your hands, I have directly caused you to be over on lifnei iver by putting it in the hands of a person who hasn't washed. Right. But with a bracha, he says, b'shashanosno eno over. The moment that I give it to you, you haven't yet been over on the isser of, eating bread or touching bread with unwashed hands. And if afterwards he doesn't eat, he eats the bread without a bracha, okay, it's not my problem anymore. In other words, there's sufficient distance between my giving him the bread and his avera of eating it without a bracha. Whereas when I put food directly into your hands and I know you didn't wash, so then I'm being over lifnei iver instantaneously. From the moment it leaves my hands into yours, you've done an avera, and I've directly aided and abetted you to hold bread that you had to wash for. The Magen Avram says that's the distinction, which, by the way, is the reason why we're generally lenient based on this Magen Avram, that if you know someone's not going to wash, as long as you don't directly put it in their hands, we can be more lenient.
Yes, and then you remote you give each person bread, not putting it in their hands, but you're putting it very close to them.
Well, okay, but still, well, you should invite everyone to wash. Right, certainly in that situation, you're not being over on lifnei iver because you don't know for sure whether they're not going to wash. And even if they tell you I'm not going to wash, you can still put the bread in front of them, and it's up to them to take it.
Now it's a secondary person.
It's a secondary person. That person may not know if the person washed, and even if they know that they didn't wash, but still they're just passing the tray around. The person has the option of taking a piece of bread, of not taking a piece of bread. Who knows if they're going to take the piece of bread? And so therefore we're generally lenient. But the point that Rav Stern wants to make from here is Umashma mehamagin Avram, the cholhecha de lo nasa havera miyad leka mishum lifnei iver. That if the avera is not done immediately after you pass it over to that person, so then there's no lifnei iver. V'hagam dahamagin Avram ve'habach mari benosein la'ani betur tzedakah. Mikol makom im hayasvir luhu diyesh bo lifnei iver lo hiya matirim zos avur tzedakah. Now they're talking about a situation where you're giving a poor man a piece of bread, but you know the poor man is not going to wash. So he says that they basically say that that as long as his hands are washed, but you don't know if he's going to make the bracha or not, then it's okay to give him the bread as tzedakah, even if he's not going to make a bracha. Well, it's an act of charity, but they wouldn't permit you to do that act of charity if there was an isser of lifnei iver, etc. And perhaps, therefore, based on what they say, there's room to be lenient in a case like ours. To put down the 20 to see if Matilda is going to take it. The kaven de b'shah shehu meniach enu nasa miyad ha'isser ve'eno vadai sheyasa klal. So when you put it down, it's not immediate. You don't even know if Matilda is going to walk into the room and take the 20. Below dami legemara b'kiddushin the parach v'dilma rasach v'ka'avar mishum lifnei iver. It's not analogous to the Gemara that we quoted before from Kiddushin, and the case over there is what's the case over there? We skipped that case. The Isa Hasam de Rav Huna Kara Shiroi Ba'apa Rabba Berei, that Rav Huna tore expensive fabric in front of his son Rabba. Amar Ezel ve'echse irasach ilo rasach. Let me see if he gets angry or not. He was testing his son to see what his temperament was. And the Gemara asks, the Dilma Rasach v'kavra lifnei iver. What if the son does become upset and the father will have caused his son to sin? Umishani demachale liyikare adkan. And so the answer is that Rav Huna was moichel on his honor. In other words, a father can be moichel on his honor and allow his son to get upset with him. And this results in the son not committing an aveira, and therefore there's no lifnei iver. Harei mavur mehagamara da'asul lenasot adam b'dvar aveira shema yikashel v'yavor al lifnei iver. So you say that you see from there that you're not allowed to test someone. So and see if they're going to do an aveira. But he says, Rav Stern says that in that situation, he says that there's an immediacy there between your action and the son becoming angry. And so therefore, if indeed through your action, immediately following that action results a sin, or could result a sin in the course of testing someone, so then there could be a lifnei iver. Ach lekushta de milsa divrei habach v'magen Avram einam pshutim u'muskalim l'kuli alma. But even then, I cannot say that what the Magen Avram says, that when there's no immediacy of sin, that there's no lifnei iver. He says the dasa Beis Yosef sham de'ein lechalek b'zeh, because the Beis Yosef says that there is no reason to differentiate whether it's immediate or not. Gam ha-Mishnah Berurah hishbit chidush zeh, and the Mishnah Berurah leaves it out. Al kein adayin yesh od lihityashev b'zeh, and therefore I really don't have a clear-cut answer. He says it could be it's okay. It could be it's usher. Shuv ra'isi b'shut Torah lishma simen tav zayin shedan b'inyan zeh v'daito lahachmir amnam lo hevi midivrei hamagen v'abachanal. I see another sefer called Torah lishma who is machmir and does not permit this activity of testing Matilda. But he doesn't bring what I brought from the Magen Avram, that since there's no immediacy involved, when you give someone a piece of bread and you suspect that they won't make a bracha, the Magen Avram says that that's permissible because there's no immediacy between you giving them the bread and they're making the hamotzi, and therefore it's okay. But other people don't bring that down this Magen Avram because it's not so simple that we paskin that way, that as long as there's no immediacy, there's no lifnei iver. But therefore he ends off with b'tzarech iyan. So there's a lot of doubt here. There's a lot of uncertainty whether testing another person, even whether Jewish or non-Jewish, by the way, because if it's prohibited for the non-Jew, then there's an isser of lifnei iver for a non-Jew as well, like we saw before. You're not allowed to place aver min hachai in front of a Gentile to cause them to eat for what for them is not kosher. Okay, so the bottom line is that he really equivocates on this halacha. He brings down another sefer which is machmir and says you're not allowed to do it. But he says it's not so simple to me that it's absolutely usher, but certainly it's questionable. The question is, what do you do when you want to test the housekeeper to make sure if she's trustworthy? I don't know. I don't have a simple answer. But to do a blatant test like that to see if she's going to steal or not might be somewhat problematic. That you certainly can do. You can set up cameras without intending to entrap them, but just wanting to monitor. That's right. That's right.
But if you have let's say you have a habit of putting beside your mem table, in your pockets, you have
Have a good